Welcome, everybody. Good evening. My name is Christine Schmidt, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. On behalf of the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event with Dr. Alex Kay in conversation with Professor Dan Stone on Dr. Kay's newest book, Empire of Destruction, A History of Nazi Mass Killing. The Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership is a consortium that comprises organizations and higher education institutions at the forefront of research and learning. The HDRP aims to be the leading voice in the UK for research-led public engagement, education, and heritage practice about the history and memory of the Holocaust and genocide. And tonight we will learn more about Alex Kay's groundbreaking new work, which examines Nazi killing in full quantitative scale. Nazi Germany killed approximately 13 million civilians and other non-combatants in deliberate policies of mass murder, mostly during the war years. Almost half the victims were Jewish, systematically destroyed in the Holocaust, the core of the Nazis' pan-European racial purification program. Dr. Kay argues that the genocide of European Jewry can be examined in the wider context of Nazi mass killing. For the first time, his book, Empire of Destruction, considers Europe's Jews alongside all the other major victim groups: captive Red Army soldiers, the Soviet urban population, unarmed civilian victims of preventative terror and reprisals, the mentally and physically disabled, the European Roma, and the Polish intelligentsia. Kay shows how each of these groups was regarded by the Nazi regime as a potential threat to Germany's ability to successfully wage a war for hegemony in Europe. So before I introduce our speakers, just a few notes of the usual housekeeping. You'll be kept on mute throughout the entire conversation, but we'll save some time at the end to hopefully get to as many questions as possible. So please feed your questions in through the chat at any time, and we will feed these back to our speakers. We are recording tonight's session, but your camera will not appear on screen. We are also using automated captioning. For those of you who need it, you can toggle this on and off at the bottom of your screen, but please note that this is automated, and so it doesn't always accurately reflect what the speakers are saying. And finally, if you have any technical issues, please send me or my colleague Imogen a direct message, and we'll do our best to help. So now to our speakers. Dr. Alex Kay is Senior Lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Potsdam and Lifetime Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. His research and teaching focuses on the history of Germany from 1918 to 1945, National Socialist policies of extermination, and comparative research on genocide and violence. He's published 5 acclaimed books on Nazi Germany, including The Making of an SS Killer. Dan Stone is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. He is a historian of ideas who works primarily on 20th century European history. His research interests include the history and interpretation of the Holocaust, comparative genocide, history of anthropology, history of fascism, the cultural history of the British Right, and theory of history. So with that, I would like to hand the virtual floor over to Dan and Alex to begin tonight's event.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening for what I hope will be an interesting discussion. I'd like just to start by congratulating Alex on the publication of this very fine and beautiful looking book. It's a great achievement. And so I'd like to start really by asking you if you could say a few words about your trajectory as a historian, how you came to write this book.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Christine, for the very friendly introduction. Yeah, I started out as, and in many ways still consider myself to be, a political historian of Nazi Germany. During or even prior to my doctoral studies, I already developed first a particular interest in the processes by which radical ideas became fully fledged policies with the full backing of the state in Nazi Germany. And second, an attachment to events in Eastern Europe, particularly the Soviet Union. And then this in turn resulted in an interest in, quite understandably, I guess, in perpetrator history, which was reflected in my publication 5 years ago of the biography that Christine mentioned of a mid-level SS officer who was a frontline Holocaust perpetrator in Lithuania and Belarus as head of a mobile death squad. And I think this new book, Empire of Destruction, in many ways reflects the culmination of my long-term interest in specifically Nazi mass violence and genocide, as well as a greater focus on survivor and other victim testimony alongside my existing focus on the perpetrators.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, well, let me ask a more specific question, which relates to the introduction of the book, where you discuss the unifying themes and explain what you're doing in the book, and you have a discussion there about the concept of genocide, and you say in the introduction that genocide, I quote you, is a very specific type of mass killing. But according to the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, killing is only one way in which genocide can be carried out. So, as you know, genocide as the intent to destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group in whole or in part, as such, and then follow the different ways in which that act can be undertaken. So, I wonder if you could be more specific about how you think the idea of genocide has informed what you're doing in the book.
Yes, yeah, true. You're absolutely right that the UN Genocide Convention regards killing as only one form of genocide, or one feature, one element of genocide, absolutely. But I also write in the introduction that the definition offered by the UN Genocide Convention inevitably represents a diplomatic compromise that was acceptable to the largest possible number of signatory states at the time of its adoption. And we can see this fact not least from the exclusion of social and political groups from the UN definition. Two groups, I think it would be fair to say that Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, would certainly have included in his own definition. Another major flaw of the UN definition, in my view, is the absence of any reference to the actual or potential perpetrator of genocide. So, in view of these flaws, and like many scholars in the field, I find the UN definition very unsatisfactory for scholarly work. And I would even go so far as to say it's kind of responsible for much of the confusion that plagues scholarly work in the field. I mean, you yourself, Dan, have referred to genocide as an essentially contested concept, and I completely agree with you. But I think that the UN Genocide Convention's definition has gone a long way towards creating this kind of quagmire, this definitional quagmire we find ourselves in. So the UN definition may be canonical in international law. I accept that. But I would dispute its value as a tool for understanding the nature of a genocide. To my mind, the intention to destroy a group, to quote from the convention, biologically is the crucial ingredient that sets genocide apart from other forms of mass killing, because at its core, genocide is a historical process that is about group reproduction. So that's where I see the specific difference between genocide and other forms of mass atrocity or mass killing. My approach in the book is to employ the concept of mass killing as a means to augment and complement rather than supplant the concept of genocide. But where it's deemed applicable, for example, regarding the murder of the European Jews, but also the killing campaigns against the mentally and physically disabled and Europe's Roma minority, I do still use the label of genocide in the book, though I don't attempt to force all these mass killing programs into the single definitional framework of genocide. So, because ultimately it's not a book on comparative genocide studies. That's not the framework I've chosen. Instead, it's a book about how Nazi killing campaigns were carried out against multiple victim groups across German-occupied Europe in the context of the war.
Thank you. That's very helpful. All right. Let me follow on from that then with a question about, well, because I think what you say makes good sense. That the term genocide might be applicable with respect to certain victim groups of the Nazis, but not necessarily all of them. In which case, what is it that provides the unifying thread through the book. I assume that there will be some historians who probably dislike placing the Holocaust side by side with, let's say, the victims of the Warsaw Uprising, or some of the other victim groups that you discuss in the book. Can you say how you make the case that one can regard the Holocaust as unprecedented, which is something that you say in the introduction, yet still situate it alongside the Nazi crimes in general?
Sure. To be honest, I personally don't see a contradiction between arguing, as I do, that the Holocaust was an unprecedented phenomenon, not least in its comprehensive and systematic nature, and regarding it simultaneously as one part of a wider process of demographic reconstruction and racial purification pursued by the Nazi regime, first in Germany itself, and then as the war progressed and the Nazi Empire grew in each and every one of the territories occupied by German forces. Let's keep in mind, and this is something I stress in the book, let's keep in mind that more than half of the victims of deliberate Nazi policies of mass murder were not Jewish. Anti-Semitism as a motivating factor cannot explain why German and Austrian perpetrators massacred, for example, Belarusian villagers, or starved German psychiatric patients, or gassed Austrian Roma. Anti-Semitism, in my view, was one, albeit central, component of Nazi ideology, but only one. I would add to that as central tenets of Nazi ideology, radical ethnic nationalism and biological racism. And I think these elements were indispensable for explaining Nazi atrocities against non-Jewish victims. So I think the problem is that as long as we continue to insist that the Holocaust must be addressed separately to the Nazis of the large-scale crimes, which, as you've said, Dan, and I agree with you, has definitely been the trend in scholarship to date, we run the risk of failing to see the very real commonalities in terms of context, of motivations, and methods, and indeed the overlaps between one and the other, between the mass killing of Jews in Europe and the mass killing of non-Jews across Europe. So what I offer now for the first time is a single book that addresses all major victim groups of Nazi mass killing together. So Christine already mentioned them, I think, in a summary, but it's worth repeating. The mentally and physically disabled within Germany and later in the occupied territories, the Polish ruling classes and elites, Jews across the length and breadth of Europe, captive and unarmed Red Army soldiers, the Soviet urban population, those civilians in primarily rural areas who fell victim to preventive terror and reprisals, especially in the Soviet Union, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece, and Europe's Roma populations. Taken together, the Nazis killed a total of 13 million civilians and other non-combatants in deliberate policies of mass murder. And if we only explain how that was possible in the case of the Holocaust, then we're leaving out the remaining 7 million effectively. So for all the differences in the nature of the victims, they had something fundamental in common. And this is one of the main arguments in my book. The commonality shared by the different victim groups is closely related to the military conflict, to the Second World War, and to Germany's strategy for winning that conflict. And while each of the killing programs undoubtedly possessed a racial and indeed racist component, the logic of war was central to the rationale for targeting each and every one of the victim groups, because they were regarded by the Nazi regime in one way or another as a potential threat to Germany's ability to fight and ultimately win a war for domination in Europe.
Thank you. Is the implication of that that we should stop writing books about the Holocaust, or that books about the Holocaust need to be more conscious of the other victims of Nazi criminality?
No, I think there's room for both. I think there's room for single subject studies on the Holocaust, studies on the fate of Soviet prisoners of war, studies on the fate of Europe's Roma minority, etc. Absolutely, and we've got some great studies on all of those separate subjects. But my argument is that it's actually very helpful to view these victim groups as a whole as well, not only look at them separately and individually, but look at what they had in common and why they were all killed, why 13 million people were murdered in the space of 6 years. And the perpetrators were the same. There were so many overlaps, in terms of, as I said, in terms of context, motivation, methods, even personnel. You had the same Nazi perpetrators killing not only Jews, but also psychiatric patients, rural dwellers in Eastern Europe. So I think there's room for both approaches, is what I'm arguing.
Okay, and one follow-up from that is, but is the implication that the Holocaust is one case of Nazi mass killing among others? When you say that the Holocaust is unprecedented, then in what sense does it still remain unprecedented when placed side by side with the other victim groups?
Yeah, good question. I just want to stress that anybody who reads my book will be could not mistake me for kind of I don't know, trying to play down the Holocaust or something like this.
That's not the logic of the question.
I just want to make that clear. 4 of the 12 chapters are exclusively on the Holocaust, and I make it clear in the introduction that I also regard the Holocaust as unprecedented. And what I mean by that is the way that every European territory under German control or within German reach was scoured for every last Jew. That was not the case for the other victim groups. So this absolutely comprehensive, systematic search to track down every last Jew and send them halfway across Europe to the gas chambers, this obsession with Jews is not visible in the persecution and murder of the other 6 victim groups. So I think you can see a difference there, definitely, that warrants this word unprecedented. I don't like to use the word unique because that almost suggests that it could never happen again, but I think unprecedented, certainly.
Great, thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. Let me change tack a little bit and ask you a bit about sources and about the other victim groups. And that's to say, one of the things that I think is most useful about the book is the chapters that you devote to Soviet POWs and other groups that for whom the historiography is actually rather sparse, especially in English, relating to Soviet POWs and the disabled outside of the borders of the Third Reich. So I wanted to ask you what sources you used, how you got hold of them, what problems did you encounter when trying to write those particular chapters? Obviously, there's an abundant literature for the Holocaust, which presents its own problems, but for the Soviet POWs and other groups, the literature is much more limited.
Absolutely, and I think the Soviet prisoners of war, as you mentioned, Dan, are a very good case in point. There's not a single monograph to this day in English on the fate and treatment of the Soviet prisoners of war, of whom over 3 million were murdered by the Nazis. They're the second largest victim group of the Nazis, and there's not a single monograph on them in English, which is a huge gap. So yeah, it's definitely true that some of these victim groups have so far been the subject of limited research in English. I would say it looks a little bit different for some of these groups in other languages. For some of them, for example, the Soviet prisoners of war, the majority of the works that I consulted were in German. And in a few cases, crucial publications were only available in Polish or Russian. For example, Maria Wawrzynska's book on the so-called intelligentsia operation against Polish elites, which from 2009, I think, is one of the most important books on that particular mass killing program, and it's only available in Polish. So I had to cast the net quite wide in terms of literature in order to cover all of these 7 major victim groups. I indicated earlier that this book exhibits kind of a greater focus on survivor and other victim testimony than my previous works did, where the focus was much more on the perpetrators. And there are now some magnificent resources available in terms of survivor and other victim testimony. I'll just name a few examples. The Jewish Survivors of the Holocaust Oral History collection at the British Library Sound Archive is a really excellent resource. The testimonies held at the National Holocaust Centre and Museum in Laxton, a smaller collection, but still very worth looking at. I drew quite extensively from both of those. The Chronicles of Terror testimony database at the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw is excellent for Polish victims, particularly Polish victims of the intelligentsia operation and the decimation of Warsaw following the unsuccessful uprising there in 1944. And as a final example, which is perhaps a little bit better known, the Claude Lanzmann Shoah collection at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. One other collection that I use that's relatively obscure and relatively recent is an extensive collection of letters by former Soviet prisoners of war, which is now held by the German-Russian Museum in Berlin. You mentioned the Soviet prisoners of war earlier on, and it's great to have that resource now of these letters by former Soviet POWs. So I used all of these. I drew from these, and in addition to drawing from these collections, I also made use of multiple published and unpublished letters and diaries, mainly by Soviet, Polish, and German civilians and officials. And I think this approach results in the inclusion in my book of often little known and incredibly powerful victim and survivor testimony. So that becomes kind of a prominent feature of the book, I would argue. Just a couple of examples. I used testimony from Josef Perl from the British Library Sound Archive. He was an adolescent Jew from Czechoslovakia who witnessed the shooting of his mother and 4 sisters in late 1941 at the age of 10. But living on his wits, somehow managed to survive multiple ghettos and concentration camps and eventually reunite with his father some 20 years after the war. And his testimony is incredibly powerful. Yura Ryabinkin, a 16-year-old Russian boy who lived with his mother and sister in the besieged city of Leningrad, whose heartbreaking struggle between hunger and conscience pervades his uncommonly honest diary entries throughout December 1941, and who sadly starved to death early the following year, one of over 1 million residents of Leningrad who starved during the blockade.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we're in Holocaust studies in general, I think probably extremely well served now for sources, and as you say, when you cast the net wider to look into other victims of Nazi crimes, then there are certainly more opportunities now than there were a few years ago. So that's really interesting, and thank you, Imogen, for all the links to the places that Alex has mentioned. Let me ask another different question, which is that I think it's perhaps somewhat against the current trend of the scholarship that in your book, the emphasis that you place on non-German collaborators is relatively less than most current scholarship, I would say, where there tends to be more a kind of discovery of the extent of collaboration across Europe. What's the role, do you think, of non-German perpetrators in all of these crimes?
Yeah, it's true that there's been some great work done over the last few years on non-German collaborators in Nazi crimes, and that's really necessary and valuable work. And it's true that my book focuses absolutely on German and Austrian perpetrators. The participation of local actors in the atrocities I discuss, though extensive in some parts of German-occupied Europe, such as Lithuania and Ukraine, does feature comparatively briefly in my book. There are some examples. We hear, for example, about the local Belarusian police who participated in massacres of Jews in the Minsk ghetto. It's quite a harrowing story about a Ukrainian at Sobibor extermination camp who slices a child in pieces with a spade, or the Azerbaijanis who were part of the infamous Dirlewanger Brigade, who slaughter tens of thousands in the Warsaw neighborhood of Wola. However, the Nazi mass killing programs were a German project, conceived of, set in motion by, and driven forward through the agency of Germans. And in addition to that, the vast majority of perpetrators were German, either from the Reich itself or from multi-ethnic borderlands, or Austrian, German or Austrian. And the vast majority of victims were killed by Germans and Austrians. So I think there's a lot to be said for focusing, largely on the German and Austrian perpetrators. In some cases, in some of these victim groups, the victims were killed exclusively by German and Austrian perpetrators. So we do see, for example, in the case of the Holocaust, or some parts of the Holocaust, we see substantial numbers of local collaborators involved, absolutely. And also in some anti-partisan operations. But many of the killing operations, such as the so-called euthanasia campaign, the extermination of Soviet prisoners of war, and the mass murder of Roma, they were exclusively German crimes. There's next to no local participation in the actual killing. And the same applies to the elimination of the Polish elites, the so-called Selbstschutz, self-protection units that played such a prominent role in decimating the ranks of the Polish ruling classes, were recruited from among ethnic Germans native to Poland. So I would argue that was a crime committed in contested multi-ethnic borderlands, not a crime of collaboration. So having said all that, I think it's worth pointing out that though it varied from territory to territory, non-German collaborators were significant in these atrocities for two main reasons, as I see it. First, the manpower they provided often meant that the scope, or at least the rate of killing, was greater than it could otherwise have been without that support, particularly where some of the mass shooting operations are concerned. And second, the assistance of local collaborators, and we see this in particular in places like Lithuania and Ukraine, as I mentioned earlier, was of considerable psychological importance because it further isolated prospective victims, for example, Jews. And taken together, these two factors ensured a much smoother implementation of several of these killing campaigns than would otherwise have been possible.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, just to say, I've got a couple more questions, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. So if anybody has a question, please type it in the chat, and then when our conversation is done shortly, then I'll take questions from the audience. Okay, so a rather different question relates to the photographs in the book. There is a section of photographs, and quite a lot of them are extremely violent and explicit images. And I wonder, I suppose the answer is there in the fact that you've published them, but I wonder what your response is to those who argue that scholars should not be using atrocity photographs.
I'm not sure I entirely agree that the photographs are extremely violent and explicit. I suppose maybe I'm kind of numbed to this to a certain extent. I understand that maybe some readers might find them extremely violent and explicit, but for example, I don't show any disfigured corpses or bodies mutilated by human experiments. Yes, the photographs do reflect the range of different killing methods in one way or another, that's true, but not all of them show the moment of death by any means. I think 4 of them do, 3 by shooting and 1 by hanging, and I think a further 4 show dead bodies. But they're also printed in the middle of the book and not strewn throughout the text, so it is possible to read the book and kind of bypass the photographs, as it were. But no, it's a fair question, absolutely, and I do understand that some readers may find the book in general harrowing. Though I would say that this applies as much and perhaps, in fact, more so to the text itself and the things I discuss in the text than it does to the photographs in particular. And my purpose, whether it's with the text or with the photographs, it's not to shock or sensationalize. And I write this I think quite early on in the book, in the introduction. On the contrary, writing a sanitized version of these events would, in my view, only succeed in making them appear more abstract. And I think that realism and accuracy would actually be sacrificed in favor of palatability. So I do think that there's, to some extent, a moral obligation to the victims to tell their story as faithfully as possible. And I understand that makes it then a tough read. But if the book is emotionally hard to read, let us maybe for a moment imagine how infinitely more difficult it must have been for the victims to suffer the events described in the book. Regarding the photographs themselves, and specifically your question, Dan, of whether it's legitimate to use them and whether they bring any added value, I came across a study recently carried out by the UCL Institute of Education. The results were published in 2016. And it's perhaps not entirely representative, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless, certainly in this context. During the study, researchers interviewed 72 secondary school students, and only one of those 72 said that these images, these atrocity photographs, need not be seen in order to comprehend the Holocaust. Only one of the 72. The overwhelming majority voiced a need to witness atrocity images in order to grasp the reality of the events and to make these events feel more human and less abstract. So I found that quite an interesting finding. So if secondary school students are making this quite clear statement that yes, seeing these images actually helps us to understand and helps us to relate to these events and makes them more human and less abstract and less statistical, then maybe we as scholars have to kind of take note of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a powerful argument. It always seems to me that people who argue that we shouldn't use atrocity photographs are arguing from the privilege of already being familiar with them, and you can't make that argument without already knowing what they are. And for students in particular who don't know what they are, I think it's impossible in a way to understand the things you're writing about without viewing them. But that's let's move on, because that's I know a different topic of discussion to some extent. I've got one final question, which is I suppose speaks to the scope of your book, and that is to say, do you think it's still the case that Western European, British and American audiences still don't really appreciate the scale of what happened on Soviet territory during World War II, despite the works of Tim Snyder and others? I think in a sense, certainly in the UK, the war narrative is still very much focused, isn't it, on Britain standing alone in 1940, and it's been altered a little bit with the inclusion of troops from the Empire and Polish airmen and so on. But that narrative of an Anglo-American victory still holds sway, I think. And one of the services that your book does is to remind us again of who actually bore the true brunt of the war.
Thank you. Yes. Do I think that Western and British and American audiences in particular don't appreciate the scale of destruction that took place in the Soviet Union? Very much so. Still, Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands was really, yeah, thanks Imogen for putting that up. I highly recommend that book, Bloodlands, because of the service that it does. It really brings the suffering in Eastern Europe to the attention of the reader. And but that still needs to be done more so, I think. Even if we just look at the number of dead, the total number of Soviet dead between 1941 and 1945 comes to a staggering 26.6 million people. 26.6. For the sake of comparison, Britain suffered around 450,000 war dead. So that's just a very, very different magnitude. Roughly 2/3 of the 13 million victims I address in the book were actually killed on Soviet territory within the borders of 22nd June 1941, when German forces invaded the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa. And it was in this theatre of war that the military conflict was most brutally fought, without doubt, and in which more of Nazi Germany's mass crimes were committed than on any other front. And the number of dead that Germany's war against the Soviet Union cost exceeded that of the other fronts several times over, in fact. And it's particularly this death toll among civilians and non-combatants that stands out here. And yeah, I guess the obvious question is why was that the case? I see this invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer 1941 as marking quite a fundamental change, actually, in both the scope and the systematic nature, not only of the war, but also of Nazi mass violence. Because for the first time, the mass murder of Jews and other racial and political opponents was the order of the day. From day one, from the very outset of the military campaign. And this campaign was conducted in an absolutely unrestrained and blatantly ideological manner. And so the result is that several major victim groups, several groups of non-combatants, civilians among the Soviet population in the territories invaded and occupied by German forces, were targeted by Nazi mass killing policies purely on the basis of their belonging to particular groups, or being assigned to one of these groups by the perpetrators. And I know you will appreciate that the significance of that point, Dan, in terms of genocide studies, that the group that perpetrators assign the victims to might be a different group than that which the victims themselves would assign themselves to. So these groups were not only the Jews, that's obviously a well-known example, but also psychiatric patients, Roma, urban dwellers in general in the Soviet Union, especially children, the sick and the elderly, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, captive Red Army soldiers. And in fact, the range of victim groups extended even further than that. Inhabitants of the countryside were likewise at serious risk of succumbing to so-called pacification operations on the part of German forces. Hundreds of thousands of residents of rural regions in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia proper were, fell victim to German terror and reprisals carried out during the campaign waged against Soviet partisans, real and imagined. So, in actual fact, then, the situation in the Soviet Union for those 4 years was one where, regardless of one's ethnic background, religion, physical and mental state, place of residence, or whether or not one wore a uniform, there was a very real chance of falling prey to the ubiquitous violence, it has to be said, spread by German agencies in the occupied Soviet territories. And maybe one final point regarding statistics, of these totals, Soviet war dead, 26.6 million, Red Army dead account for 14.6 million, which leaves about 12 million Soviet civilian deaths. However, if we deduct from the total of Red Army dead the 3.3 million troops who perished as prisoners of war, as unarmed captive prisoners, and add them to the civilian toll, it becomes clear that the majority of Soviet war dead, more than 15 million people, comprised civilians and unarmed captured soldiers.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex, for the very thorough and comprehensive answer. Yeah, I mean, I think I always recommend the Belarusian film Come and See,
yes.
From 1986, one of the last great Soviet films. I think for an appreciation of the extent to which Belarus was flattened and completely destroyed by the Third Reich. That's a stunning illustration of it. It's a tough film, but it's brilliant in terms of, I think, aiding our understanding of that.
I agree with you 100%, Dan. It is a really tough film to watch, and I know people who've seen it and have said this cannot be realistic or true to life. I don't believe that German forces behave like this, but I've seen it, and I also know fellow historians working in this area who have seen it, and we agree that it's probably the most accurate depiction on film of what it must have been like in occupied Belarus.
No, I'm glad you said that. That kind of confirms my view of the film as well. So, okay, good. Thank you very much for those really comprehensive answers. And I recommend the book very strongly. It's a really fascinating read. So thank you. We've got some questions from the audience, and the first one is from Grant Gotchin, who says that you mentioned atrocities by Azerbaijani troops. Should we say Azeri troops? Anyway, Azerbaijanis in the fighting for the Third Reich, and he says that's new information for me. Do you have a link or a reference? Maybe you could just say a little bit more about Azeris fighting for the Germans.
If it's Azeris, Dan, and not Azerbaijanis, then I've made a mistake.
Well, I don't know. I'm yeah.
Okay, I'll have to make a note of that for the reprints. No, you're absolutely, yeah, I think you're right, actually. Yeah, so the Dirlewanger Brigade, as Imogen has written in the chat, was a unit of the Waffen-SS, and they recruited from across occupied Europe, and they tended to recruit ethnic Germans or people from related races, from the Nazi point of view, across Europe. The Dirlewanger Brigade was a little bit of an exception, however, to that, to the extent that it started out as a penal battalion, and many of its members were actually recruited from concentration camps and among convicted criminals. I don't know the actual identity of the Azeris in the unit, and it's actually the only time I've come across Azeris being in a Waffen-SS unit or an SS unit, full stop. I don't know how much more background I could give on that. It seems to be quite an anomaly, actually, that Azeris were members of the Waffen-SS unit, but I think they totaled about 700 men in this particular brigade, and were made up part of the formation that entered Warsaw in early August 1944 to put down the uprising there. Brilliant. I don't know if that's enough information, but this is very the exact recruitment kind of methods when it comes to the Azeris are a little bit in the dark there. I'm not sure about that.
Well, I think that's very helpful. And Grant, who asks the question, says that Azerbaijanis is the correct term. So no need to correct anything. That's just I'll shut up. There's a question from Sandra Lipner, who says she'd be interested to know what you think about Dirk Moses' arguments around permanent security, and if and how it fits into your argument around the regime's view of the 7 victim groups as posing a potential threat to Germany's ability to wage a successful war for hegemony.
Yeah, really good question. Very up to date, because Dirk's new book has only been published this year, I think, by Cambridge University Press. So it's very current. And yeah, I would say a lot of his arguments along those lines do support what I'm saying. And he cites, for example, the head of Einsatzgruppe D, one of the SS mobile death squads in the occupied Soviet territories, Otto Ohlendorf, saying at Nuremberg, yeah, we actually killed the children as well because they would have grown up and taken their revenge. So this idea that Ohlendorf, already in Nuremberg in 1945, 1946, advocated that they posed a threat. They actually weren't just racial or ideological enemies, but they actually posed a tangible threat to Germany's ability to win the war. Dirk picks up on that, and that's part of his argument there. And I think that it fits in very nicely with what I'm saying, that as bizarre as it seems to us, the Nazis really did view each of these groups as a legitimate threat to German domination in Europe and Germany's ability to successfully wage a war. I think Dirk's coming at it from a slightly different angle to me, because he's coming very much more from the field of comparative genocide studies. And I know that he thinks that his book is called The Problems of Genocide, and his argument is that this focus on genocide as the crime of crimes, perhaps almost to the exclusion of other mass atrocity crimes, has done more harm than good in many ways, because often a victim group or a state has to prove effectively that that genocide has taken place in order for the international community to actually get involved and do something. And that shouldn't be the criteria for taking action, of course, whether something qualifies as genocide or not. So I think he makes a very valid argument there, and we maybe need to get away from the idea that only genocide can count as worthy of intervention, because there are many other atrocities and instances of mass violence across the globe that maybe wouldn't qualify either in legal terms or scholarly terms as genocide, but definitely require intervention by the international community.
Thanks, Alex. And I have a nice small question from Bastian Willems, who says, could you perhaps reflect on the motivations of the perpetrators? How much of the behavior was rooted in mere National Socialism, and how much can be explained by longer standing ideas of racism, eugenics, nationalism, exclusion, segregation, and so on, that predate Nazi rule? How long have you got?
Yeah, thanks, Baz. Thanks for this really easy question when we've got 10 minutes to go. I appreciate that.
We're happy to extend if you are, Alex.
Yeah, this is obviously the question, isn't it? And it's something that I devote quite a bit of time to in the conclusion, as kind of the culmination of a lot of what I've written in the earlier chapters of the book. Clearly, it wasn't merely National Socialism. I think the causes date back much further, definitely to the First World War, and probably earlier than that. And in my book, I try to explain how the First World War, and particularly the defeat, Germany's defeat in the First World War, and everything, the aftermath, everything that followed afterwards, revolution at home and the dissemination of the stab in the back myth, this was kind of a touchstone for the Nazis later on. They constantly referred to it during the Second World War. The perpetrators constantly referred back to the First World War. We cannot let the same thing happen as happened to us during the First World War. We find this in speeches, motivational speeches by commanders to their men. We have to do everything possible to prevent a repeat of the First World War. So in the Nazi mindset, anything that prevented a repeat of Germany's fate in the First World War was legitimate in their mind, yeah? And that meant no holds barred. That meant anything was, as long as it served that purpose of preventing a repetition of the First World War, then it was legitimate. And this runs like a red thread through the war years, this constant reference to the First World War. So definitely a lot of the mindset of the perpetrators is very entrenched in this, what I describe as an individual and collective trauma for Germany, the First World War. And I think this trauma is really then passed on through society. So it's not just the people who the so-called, war youth generation that was too young to fight in the First World War, but actually then either younger people who came of age during the Nazi regime. This collective trauma is something really ingrained in the German people of these generations. And I mean, certain ideas go back to the time even before the First World War, but I do see the First World War as really a touchstone, as a turning point in terms of the mindset of German people living at the time and subsequent generations. So it definitely goes, it's not merely National Socialism, it definitely starts much, much earlier. And you already see, for example, you mentioned eugenics, Baz, already in the 1920s, you see German psychiatrics, the psychiatric profession taking a much more radical line than its counterparts in other European countries. You do see a kind of, I've got to be a little bit careful here, but you do see a kind of almost uniquely or particularly German development here. And so what I would say is that these generations of Nazi perpetrators, and it wasn't just one generation, it was multiple generations. I would say that these people were not necessarily ordinary men, to use Christopher Browning's phrase, but ordinary Germans at a particularly radical and radicalized moment in history. Which brings us to context. Yeah, context is kind of crucial here. A lot of factors come together against the backdrop of this defeat in the First World War and crystallize to create this mindset and this motivation among the perpetrators. I don't know how well I've explained that, but maybe read the conclusion of my book, where I develop the argument a little bit more.
It's an extraordinary question, and so I think that was a pretty impressive answer. But can I just follow, because there are no further questions in the chat, so maybe I can just follow up on Baz's question. Yeah, good, a bit more advertising for the book there going on, and say you mentioned a little bit about eugenics, but do you see eugenics as one of the unifiers behind these different attacks on these different groups? Or is it specific solely to one or two of them?
You could see it as a unifier, because I think with regard to all 7 victim groups, there's definitely the conviction among the perpetrators that these groups are a biological threat. Yes, really a racial biological threat. And you often see an intertwinement of multiple kind of sets of argumentation. So you'll have certain victim groups demonized for a multitude of reasons. Even in a single document, a single report or a single speech, certain victim groups will be demonized for 3 or 4 or 5 different reasons. So as though the perpetrators felt they had to name as many reasons as possible to kill these innocent civilians. And one of them is invariably this biological component, definitely. And other reasons are kind of, if you take the Roma, for example, yeah, they're itinerants, so they're vagabonds, so they're unreliable per se. Biologically, they're of a different race, so we can't Germanize them. They've got they've got contact with partisans, so they must be working for the partisans, etc. So there's this kind of bringing together of multiple arguments in order to demonize victim groups. So yeah, I think so, Dan, that you can definitely see eugenics and biological racialism or racism as a unifying factor in the perpetrator's mindset. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, there are no further questions in the chat, so I think we'll it's probably time to bring this to a close. So I just want to say thank you so much for the very thorough answers. It's been a pleasure to listen to them. And with that, I will hand over to Imogen.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Dan. Good evening, everyone. I'm Imogen DL. I am the Programme Coordinator for the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Christine Schmidt and Dan Stone, particularly Dan for his excellent chairing of tonight's event. Alex Kay, whose book I am very, very much looking forward to reading soon. And last but not least, of course, the audience for all your comments, questions, and your attendance. Just to flag that the next partnership event will be a hybrid event. For the first time, we have an in-person element at one of our events. Professor Jan Grabowski from the University of Ottawa will be delivering the second annual Alfred Wiener Holocaust Memorial Lecture with a lecture on Holocaust history under siege. This will take place on the evening of the 17th of November. This is presented by the HDRP in partnership with Gresham College. It will be held in person at the Museum of London, but virtual tickets are available. I am going to multitask and put the link in the chat now. And I will also include the link in the email that I send in the next couple of days, which will also have a link to the recording of tonight's session, which will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So with that, thank you very much all for attending and enjoy the rest of your evening or your day, depending where you're joining from. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.